It is so good to see all of you. Familiar faces and some new faces and former students, that's always cool. And the children of former students, Andrew Try, that's super cool. And I guess you know when you've been around a while, when young biologists have their PhD and their parents were your students and they met in one of my classes. So I think I can take partial credit for that, Andy, but you know, if there's any frailties, then yeah, I may maybe share some of the blame. Well, this is fun occasion. 50 years ago, I started at the Crookston campus of University of Minnesota to start a natural resources program. And wow, as I was putting things together for this presentation, a lot has changed. Some good, some not so good. And hopefully I try to be an optimistic guy, and I'll try to stick in a little optimism wherever I can, because when you ponder what Bruce was explaining, it could be a little depressing. You know, especially the population thing, which 50 years ago was really a current issue. Those of you that are a little bit long in the tooth and short on the hair and grayer hair or whatever, you remember that, the days of Paul Ehrlich. Well, now sometimes people are reluctant to even bring up population thing. Well, Christ, it's worse now than it ever was. So challenges are huge. Well, changes and challenges in Minnesota prairies. I'm a plant and wildlife sort of guy with a soft spot for prairies. And I live and have done my career in northwestern Minnesota, and I've been blessed with the opportunities to experience a lot of about prairies, animals and plants. This is kind of an overview of my presentation, looking a bit at the just the physical environment where prairies occur and the distribution of prairies. And I borrowed heavily from a presentation that Rhett Johnson gave not too long ago at the Minnesota Natural Areas Conference. Rhett Johnson is a DNR prairie ecologist based in Windham. And then, so where are prairies? Some of the management approaches and challenges based on my experiences and the experiences of others, looking at some of the different factors in climate change and fire and grazing and hazing, haying and so on. And some of the lessons learned from the field. And I was fortunate to get input from some seasoned veterans and not so seasoned people that work with the prairies based on their experiences. And those will be available, I think, electronically later. And then we're going to have a panel discussion later. So just to, and these are slides from Rhett Johnson, to talking about just the physical environment of the prairies that come together to form the central grasslands. So, you know, that is our focus here, and that darkened area where prairies extend into Manitoba, that's the primary focus with my experience based here in the Northwest. So looking at the air masses first, and then the surface glacial deposits, different glacial advances coming from different directions. Some parts of the state were not glaciated, so that leaves a different topography. And the various lobes, again, this is a map that Rhett Johnson developed and did some wonderful work. Some of the primary glacial features of the state, or geologic features, and glacial Lake Agassiz. This is where Terry Wolf and I call home, and some other people. There's been several former students here from Crookston that have experienced this. This landscape is still pretty flat up there, those of you that haven't been there in a while. But this area, and this is Polk County, kind of a U-shaped county, where there's the Beech Ridge country, where you have a lot of difference in topography as well as soil texture. This is the northern extent of the maple, basswood, oak forest, and then the oak savanna then extended farther north from that. So it's a really interesting area topographically and geologically. And the prairie originally it was distributed over this kind of an area, and there's, I don't know, 1-2% or so of the original prairie landscape that still remains, little pockets of prairie where there's soil conditions that promote that out in the forested area. And I don't know, we are somewhere in here, and you see a lot of big blue stem this time of year growing along roadsides, and so it's a really interesting part of North America. And when I first looked at interviewing for a job at Crookston, I took out Marshner's map to see what the topography and the whole situation was around Crookston, and I was liking the area already, even though I had never been there, and it turned out well for me. Well, and this is a slide from Rhett Johnson looking at prairie areas in Minnesota in 5 different sectors, starting here in the so-called driftless part of Minnesota, unglaciated, with goat prairie, so to speak, and then wrapping up here with Area 5, the Lake Agassiz region. And so I'll just launch into the different slides, looking at the southeastern prairies, area 1, the driftless area, or goat prairies, bluff prairies, whatever. And so this will give you kind of a visual look. For those of you not too familiar with that part of the state, you can wind up with one leg shorter than the other, like I did growing up in the Ozarks of Missouri, you know, from walking on those hills around there. Boy, this is a quiet crowd. No chuckles at all. That was a joke, folks. I have subtle humor. Anyhow, that's where that slide was taken, and these were put together by Rhett Johnson. Did a wonderful job. And cedar invasion is one of the challenges there, and a special group of plants in some areas that are there's a lot of limestone exposed, so they tend to be somewhat calciophilic. So that's where that was taken. This is in Houston County, Fillmore County, another one of the goat prairies, and even some birch mixed in there along with the eastern red cedar. Wabasha County, located here, not too far from the Mississippi River, and some of the characteristic plants Rhett has distributed throughout here. And this is Olmsted County, the Oronco, and I've not seen all of these prairies, but I'm really intrigued to try to get around to as many of them as I can. This is Dodge County down here. Emily Hutchins, that would probably be close to your home area. Yeah. This is the Iron Horse Prairie, SNA. This is a railroad prairie in Mower County down near Iowa. I don't know if there's any shooting stars in that area or not, but there's some shooting stars someplace down there, which was a plant that I grew fond of in Missouri. It was very common in prairie tracts. This is Brown County. Looks like a rattlesnake master here, but that's located right here, the Minnesota River Prairies subsection. And this is Area 2, which includes the Anoka Sand Plain north of the Twin Cities. And let's see, would it extend as far north as Brainerd? Probably pretty close. And so some of the characteristic prairie remnants include these slides. This is Sherburne County. This is Sherburne National Wildlife Refuge. And Uncle Dunes Scientific and Natural Area, also in Sherburne County. Looks like some Artemisia here. The Allison Savannah in Anoka County. Without fire, of course, these areas would quickly become forest, especially with rising amounts of precipitation that we've been having in recent years, which I'll get to in a moment. Area 3, southwestern prairies, the Prairie Coteau, areas associated with the Minnesota River and Yellow Medicine County and so on. This is the Mound Spring Prairie Natural Scientific and Natural Area in Yellow Medicine County. And some of the characteristic plants that look like lead plant there. I'm not sure what kind of moth it is, but it's a pretty cool one. And Lincoln County, the Hole in the Mountain Prairie near Lake Benton, Looks like a little tour group out on the hillside there, which is kind of cool. And this is the Kanarabi, if I'm pronouncing that right, Valley Prairies in Murray County. Looks like some prairie lily there. And again, Coteau Prairies, that extends into South Dakota, which is pretty cool. And another one of the examples of the rolling topography, I just now noticed that. It's apparently has a history of grazing. You can see the little terraces there, which tend to be accentuated by cattle grazing over the years. And whoops. This is a private pasture. And one of the things that Red put in his notes was, note that there's no reed canary grass. And many of us have grown to hate reed canary grass. I usually insert another adjective in there when I pronounce it, but at any rate, it looks like a little seepage spraying area, kind of cool. Looks like some pines planted there in the background. But Derek Anderson has this little tribute to these prairies. Little victories and special places often get lost in the negatives and the mass conversion that occurred before it was realized the Great Plains did have limits. That's Blue Mountains State Park, which many of our have a good friend of Jim Brandenburg. He spent a lot of time in that part of the state. In fact, he's from there. And then the west central prairies out along this western bump of Minnesota, the Alexandria Moraine. Some of the cool prairies there. This is the Seven Sisters Prairie, a species of Castelligia. We even have a little list in northwestern Minnesota as well. This is the Ordway Prairie. Carmen Converse took this beautiful slide of this transition. Probably this remnant little forest here is a kind of an artifact of the prevailing winds when the fires would come through, which you can see that sort of thing in that part of the state. And the native prairie bank easement, this is Candy, Ojai County. See, how am I doing on time there? Oh, plenty of time, okay. Well, you got to watch saying that to a southerner. Oh, you got plenty of time. But, okay, but this is, they may have toasted some cedars there too. This maybe looks like a box elder with some of the remnant seed pods on it. But this is a progression of the same area there and the rejuvenation of the prairie, which all of you here have witnessed that, and it's pretty cool to see a prairie come back to life after it was smothering in the shade of other trees. And this is Candy, Ojai County. They just don't make this stuff anymore. Well, what more can you add to that with some liatris and sunflowers? This is the Shellberg NPB in this part near that little bump of Minnesota. This is the Prairie Bank, which means that this would be under private ownership still. And thanks to things like the Prairie Bank, they're still being protected and preserved. Small white lady slipper, one of my favorites, a petite little lady slipper orchid. That's in Lackawanna County. Swift and Chippewa counties doing a little census work. Big Stone, Lackawanna County. This is bedrock that is exposed there, and the Minnesota River, as I recall, used to flow bank full at one time in geologic history, and I think it was about 1.5 miles across. So that was one rolling river that eroded things down to bedrock in some areas. So that's kind of neat. And then we get to Area 5, northwestern Minnesota Prairie, the Red River Valley, where, I mean, it's flat enough you can almost see the back of your head up there someday, if it's a clear day. And this is Polk County, one of my favorites. So we have the Glacial Lake prairies that, due to their sandy and rocky soil, they survived as long as they did in order to get preserved. And so a little bit more on that. So an overview of some of those prairies. This is Malmberg Prairie, which is right out in the middle of the Red River Valley. And that was really a stroke of good fate that was, I think it's 80 acres. that is surrounded by sugar beets and now soybeans and corn, but that's a special treasure. That was one of the first acquisitions by the Minnesota chapter of the Nature Conservancy. As was, this is Miller Prairie here, back down the southern valley. This is Miller Prairie. Matt Mecklenburg works for the Nature Conservancy, took that. But this is the Beech Ridge country, and it's really cool because the shores of Glacial Lake Agassiz had a lot of wave action here as the lake level was fluctuating due to the coming and going of glacier to the north, which then cut off exit paths for the water. But you have a variety of soil textures, and the west side of these beech ridges, or in some cases the north side, is an area of groundwater discharge. Well, that's a special area because you have calcareous fins. And so that's one of the special treats that we have up in our areas. Well, Fertile is on the south edge of Polk County, and there's glacial sand dunes there. And when the Glacial Lake Agassiz drained, you had all this sand that had washed in from the surrounding rivers. And then that was worked by the wind. There was a dry period. So you have these sand dunes. They're covered primarily by open-grown bur oaks, stunted, generally speaking, but it's a very special area. And another one of the first areas that the Minnesota chapter of the Nature Conservancy acquired. And this is kind of a photo sequence in 2011 that Rhett took, showing the same sign, and starting out in the spring. And that wasn't taken in 2011, but it's a recent slide, taken in conjunction with the local Fertile Fire Department. So it's an example of partnerships as they're helping burn Agassiz dunes. And here's a little fire tornado of sorts, and some of you may have experienced those, and they're pretty cool, especially when they're 40 feet high. And the fire is, well, what would we say, Terry Wolf? Was it a little bit out of control, or we just hadn't defined the management limits yet? But anyway, so thanks to Terry, at about 11 o'clock one night, I got to see a 40-foot high fire whirlwind. They're awesome. Well, you feel really helpless because you can't do anything about it at all when that fire whirlwind is 40 feet in the air. And they kind of roar, and they pull in air. Yes, John?
Down south, we learned that as the Svedarsky method.
Okay.
It's a good way to get a lot of prairie burn to win.
Thanks, John. But good old partnerships. And this is it's the 19th of April, and then May is starting to green up a little bit. Top killing of the sumac. Oaks are fine, generally speaking, unless it's a really hot fire and there's accumulation of duff or something. And then in May, and then in June, and then in July, resprouting of the sumac, and then you get the fall color, that wonderful reddish tone with the fall color of sumac. And then in September, I guess this is Rhett's hand up here. And then September, and then one of the really unique species is downy prairie clover. It's a pedalostemum. I think they've retained named the genus now, but that's the only place I've seen it. This downy prairie clover is. And then we have the bluestem prairie, which is where Brian Winter spends a lot of time, just east of Moorhead there. The prairie fringed orchids, which is one of our stars in the show up in that area, as well as the prairie chicken. I have just a little bit of bias for the greater prairie chickens. And then the Felton Prairie Complex, and there's lots of different ownerships there, and some high dry prairies with really commanding vistas of the Red River Valley and prairies. But there's also gravel pits there. It's a rich area for gravel production. And then the Glacial Ridge complex, the blue there is primarily where the Glacial Ridge is now, and the gold area here, many of those are, I guess perhaps all of them were acquired by wildlife managers. This is the Kirstenville, not Kirstenville, but Timpanoukas area acquired by Jerry Martins, now retired wildlife manager, but still active behind the computer and so on. But this is one of our crown jewels in the way of prairies. And Terry Wolf and Ross Heyer have been involved in acquiring these, and other folks. But this was the only new National Wildlife Refuge created that particular year, and I'm hemmed in here by some really good neighbors, and so I don't complain too much. But this is the Pancreas Prairie, named after a former student at UMC, and some of the plants that you can find on that one prairie, from the wetter tendencies with the prairie fringed orchids to the dry areas of passflower and a little bit of coneflower here and there. Pretty neat area, a nice topo sequence. Ben Thoma, those of you remember him, Ben Thoma helped me make this sign. Ben is now departed, used to be the longtime naturalist at Itasca State Park. And this is the Pembina Trail Preserve that, due to the urging of Jerry Martins, he convinced me to build a little fire going, and with the Nature Conservancy, and we went down and made a presentation to the board, and then Morris Patterson. Some of you remember Morris Patterson, and he went out with a couple of scientific types doing an evaluation. Well, you know, timing can be everything, and it just so happened that the prairie fringed orchids were flowering when we were doing the scientific and natural area thing evaluation. Well, Pat was there, and those of you who remember Krusty Pat, with Dick Pimble and Jerry Van Amberg, they were in flower. Pat happened on the one, and Pat yelled out, "Jesus Christ, look what's flowering over here!" And he had a booming voice, and then we walked on. Well, here's another one. And then he would follow this up, and pardon my bluntness here, but Pat then would say, "Bye, the son of a bitch." Well, the Pembina Trail Preserve was acquired, and thanks Pat for his enthusiasm. And even though a lot of it was at one time old pasture, it still worked out. And then you get up into the Aspen parkland. That's kind of a neat area where you have this mix and blending of brush and prairie and aspen, and this is kind of an aerial shot, and it's really it's much more extensive in Canada than it is, but we have just a tongue of it that comes down into northwestern Minnesota. You have a lot of scrub oaks. This is the Beech's Lake Wildlife Management Area, open grown bur oak, and so it's just really a neat area. This is the Caribou Wildlife Management Area up near the Canadian border. And so that's kind of a pictorial view of Minnesota prairie. They're really diverse. You look from one end of the state to the other. Well, looking at some of the changes, challenges, and management approaches, and it's going to be a little bit skipping around here, but some of the changes. The climate is changing. It's getting wetter. There's been a lot of conversion in the last 50 years. Thankfully, there's been a lot of acquisition and preservation in that. Invasive species, forest invasion, oh my gosh, invasive, and it seemed like every time I visit with Rhett Johnson, he tells me about a couple more species that are now on the list of invasive plants. There's been degradation, lack of natural disturbance in the fire regime and so on. Nutrient loading can be a problem, pesticide drift, and particularly Roundup. And it's been heartbreaking to see some of the roadside railroad prairies that have been converted to brome, essentially, because of the drift that has come from spraying. Now we have Roundup Ready corn and Roundup Ready soybeans, and then of course fragmentation. So just looking at some of the kind of a potpourri, looking over the state of some of those different changes. This is a slide I got from Nikki Hansel Welch, who's with the Shallow Lake program. And you can see here, this is in Otter Tail County by decades since the 1970s, how the average precipitation has grown. And this is 2011 plus. And all of us have seen areas of wetlands that where you have trees that are flooded out, where the water is 5-6 feet deep around the base of the tree. And obviously, there's a whole lot more water in there now. But I guess on the good side, they can produce good bass fishing. And being a southern guy, I had a lot of fun bass fishing. But they're not as good for waterfowl habitat. So it's kind of a mixed blessing there. But that has changed. And that precipitation is going to come sometime, and it may narrow the burn window. And so that can create some challenges. This is the Twin Cities, showing the variation from the 1910s to the 2010s, a 100-year period of time. So the areas are getting wetter. Other threats, gravel mining. Now, I don't know if that chicken is looking at that gravel mine. It's north of the Pancreas Prairie in Polk County. This is taken by a former student. He just stuck a camera up blindly out the window of the blind, and it turned out to be a pretty dang good picture. So gravel mining, and this is in the Felton Prairie landscape. Lots and lots of gravel, and we need gravel for a lot of different reasons, but it comes with a price. And we have wind machines, and those have some impacts. It's somewhat debatable as to the exact. And this was a heartbreaker for me. This was right near the Pembina Trail Preserve back in the 70s, and but it gets worse. This is about as bad as it can get. This is a white fringed orchid, and I went out there, and it was just a heartbreaker seeing all these white fringed orchids, and then I knew it was going to get plowed up. So what I did is I picked a bouquet of prairie fringed orchids, and I took it to the landowner who was developing this, and he was just a short timer from Missouri. Remember him, Terry? Letty was his name. Anyhow, so this was later, but I picked a bouquet, took it over to his house, and I says, Jimmy, I got something I want to show your wife. Well, she and her kids were watching TV. It's in the middle of the summer, and it's in the middle of the day when they could have been out, doing nature with her. Honey, come and look at these flowers. She came, oh, what are those? I said, well, they're orchids. Yeah, pollinated, blah, blah, blah. It didn't register at all. Oh, well. But that's one of the penalties when you have an ecological education, as Leopold so nicely put it. We live alone sometimes in a world of wounds. So this was afterwards. It was very drouthy soils, should have been left in prairie. Anyway, I went to a prairie that was being broken one time, and it occurred to me for the first time, this wood lily is actually a weed because it's growing so-called out of place. Anyway, and this is a DNR tract being fragmented. Obviously, this is going to change the hydrology in that area. So fragmentation is an issue. I think this is the Helixson Prairie, those of you that are familiar with that area. But they're fragmented. This is the Pembina Trail Preserve as this land was being developed next to it. And the person doing the work didn't even have any appreciation for it. Yeah, somebody uses this road to get in and do research and blah, blah, blah. It was later fixed, but, and then forest moving in, brush. This is, let's see, this is near Granite Falls with eastern red cedar, which has really spread, especially in these glade prairies. This is the Pancreas Prairie. I live right here, so I followed this area for, not since 1948, but it was quite open in 1948. This is the Burlington Northern Railroad track, and this is the former track of Burlington Northern. And this is a reference point right here, this little circular area. That's a depression made by buffalo rubbing around that rock in past times. So this is the Kirtonville Wildlife Management Area, and this is Pancras South, really a pretty cool area. This 1966, still relatively open, but fall haying was a very common practice in those days, and it was shipped by rail primarily to the racehorse industry in Kentucky and Tennessee. But it's really good at keeping the forest and the brush at bay, and of course also had more precip since that time. And then in 2015, you can see it's getting, and it's even brushier than what it looks like there. And there's the pancreas prairie buffalo rock. And there's the buffalo rock. And again, that, I guess you would call that, because it was shaped by the bison. And that has been hydroaxed one time and burned at different times. But sometimes burning, depending on how it's applied, and there you see kind of the sequence, can be more stimulating. Now you see it makes it worse as far as the density of the vegetation and then the shading effect. And this is wildfire. In some case, I had a little management burn that, well, let's say, got a little bit enlarged, and so I got to meet some people from that. A little bit embarrassing, but a good conversation starter, so to speak. But this is on Pancreas North, and those of us that are prairie burners, yeah, we usually have some of those stories. But again, you run an area through you run a fire through an area, you top kill a lot of brush, it comes back thicker than it was before. So what do you do next? And another thing that was kind of interesting, and I didn't realize that until I was looking at these slides later, is red osier dogwood. Now in this case, it was brought in by a fence, being a perching spot for seed-carrying birds. But wow, it's really thriving in some areas. Now it's a native species, of course, but it can still have a shading effect. Well, some of the trends in animal changes over the years. This is a fisher. This is out my taken with a cell phone, not this picture, but this one here, chewing on a deer skin, out my living room window. These have become more common. In fact, they've become so common that Ross and Terry used to put up wood duck boxes in northwest Minnesota for years, and then they realized that they were creating death traps for the nesting wood ducks and hooded mergansers. Do these guys, because these guys apparently zeroed in on that as a search image for there's a real good meal there. So then they took them all down and had a big bonfire out at the Mentor Prairie. So that has changed. They seem to have kind of tapered off a little bit more recently, though. We used to see a lot of these. Not quite so many anymore. Uplands, I still call them upland plovers. That was good enough for Old Leopold, good enough for me. Now they call them upland sandpipers. Marble godwits, or some people call them marble halfwits. But they were very common on these mowed prairies. And as the prairie haying thing passed out of the pictures, these guys are not so common anymore. And this is the Pembina Trail Preserve. There's that buffalo rock. Sandhill cranes have become a common nesting species in recent years. It's not that big of a deal to find a nest these days. And there's the nesting sandhill, and there she's peeking out. And that's after they splash mud on themselves to kind of blend in a little bit more. And apparently that's due to the dyeing from the iron oxides in the mud. And magpies. This is right outside my window. I remember when I first came to Crookston, Jerry Martins had a little publication, I think it was in the Minnesota Loon, on the first nesting magpie in Marshall County, I believe it was. Well, now they're very common. I've had up to 3 pairs within 50 yards of my house some years. And these guys here, ravens, they started showing up, I don't know, 20 or so years ago. And now I see them scavenging in the Hugo's parking lot in Crookston, just like in Europe. So that's kind of interesting. And they have a distinctive croak, which adds to the Prairie Symphony, I guess. But things are changing. And these guys, it used to be a noteworthy deal to see an eagle. This is on a lone cottonwood tree out on the Glacial Ridge. Now the Glacial Ridge National Wildlife Refuge. So, in fact, around Detroit Lakes years ago, there was one actually nested on the ground. And the Fish and Wildlife Service had to take out an easement that year, a 1-year easement, to protect that nest on the ground in a grain field or something like that. But anyhow, things change. These guys are now crop pests in some cases, getting depredation complaints. Wish Carol was here. I'd like to shake his hands for his good work. Okay, 10 minutes? 10 minutes? Okay, good. These guys here, they showed up at my place about 3 years ago. What? I thought I left those behind in Missouri. And so I don't know, but I'll bet you these guys would like a little fuzzy prairie chicken. And I guess I like prairie chicken more than turkeys, but I diverge. So we've got these guys. Well, in managing this dynamic prairie that is used to vagrancies of weather and climate and fires and grazing and mowing, and how do you manage that? Bring it all together. Well, when to apply? You look at, talking primarily of perennial plants here, herbaceous as well as woody things. If you look at the annual cycle, you have to look at what's going on in the basement as far as their food reserves. They're using food at this point in time, so that's when they're vulnerable to do the top kill and remove that photosynthetic area. And then they're storing food. So you at the time of least damage later on. And you have to adjust this depending on whether or not, depending on the phenology of the plant, whether it's it's more of a cool season plant or a warm season plant. These are warm season plants here that peak out in July and August, and cool seasons have an earlier peak and then a later peak. So how to time our defoliation management to maximize that injury is critical. Mowing tends to be non-selective, takes all of it. This is a bat mower from Wisconsin, and they're managing their prairie chicken areas years ago. This was just east of Crookston for years. It's brushy. You can't even see where the prairie was now. It's just a brushland area. But it was pretty nice prairie that was maintained. And this would have originally been oak savanna, because you can find open-grown oak trees in those aspen groves. Fire tends to be non-selective if you can get it to burn and hot enough for top killing. And some of you may not be Johnny Cash fans, but he had a song. What was the name of it? There we go. Thank you. That's Tom Farrel's, and he did survive. He did survive there. And the grazing, it's generally selective, but if you have a lot of animals in there all season long, then it can be pretty intensive. So this can change. This is right across the road from the Timpanoukas Wildlife Management Area. It can change the composition of the plants. This is some demonstration grazing we did on Pancreas Prairie, and but we just had them in there on a periodic basis. And then there's a lot of variations in how this, if you have a really wet year, you have cattle in an area, and the farmer puts them in there for a period of time. Well, if it's really wet, there can be a lot of trampling, and you have an entry for invasive species come in, like reed canary grass. You can do rotational grazing or mowing or whatever in kind of a rotational basis, and this is kind of a model that I whipped up one time for looking at CRP, how you might do it. Have an intensive mowed area in the middle for prairie chicken displays and so on. Patch burning, and many of you know the different variations of that, where a combination of burning and grazing in kind of a patchwork, and that is being applied on Glacial Ridge National Wildlife Refuge. This is actually in Oklahoma, I think it is. And some of you may have seen this slide, and this is an illustration of what Rich Jornt, who worked for the Fish and Wildlife Service in Detroit Lakes, called the law of the one son of a bitch. Pardon my Russian again, but this one here, that's an old bull that's, he's doing something different than the rest of them. But I have more examples of that law and applications of it. Another thing that's developed is seed harvesting of native prairie. I would imagine that there's maybe 150 people that work in some aspects of prairie restoration, whether the harvesting and the planting and so on in Minnesota. Well, in 1969, that was really new on the landscape. Al Johnson at the Landscape Arboretum at the university was doing a little bit of it, but he's about the only one. And there's more focus on insects now. This is a summary slide from Rhett Johnson that shows the percent of protection that is afforded in prairies by the different entities, so that's pretty cool. 52% is protected. That is a take-home message, 24,000 acres. Okay, we have a prairie plan, Minnesota Prairie Conservation Plan, and the former commissioner Tom Landwehr was involved in getting that together. That is really cool. That has identified the best of what's left, so we can set priorities, because you can't manage it all at the same time that you need to, but that's good. There's more focus on insects and restoration of Dakota skippers, in this case, in the whole of the mountain prairie. This was a recent article that celebrates partnerships. And John Boss, who works for Bowser, and also in close conjunction with the Minnesota Prairie Chicken Society. This is in Clay County, and this was involving also Pheasants Forever. And I think there's a couple of employees of Pheasants Forever in here. Woohoo! The partnership synergy has just been great. So this is a fairly recent development. Let's see, August 9th. And importance of education. I don't know who the old guy is, but there's 4 people in that slide that are now working for the NRCS. Paige Getter here now works for Bowser. And some of you may recognize Tyler Janke, who went on to become my master's student. When he came to UMC, he was only going to do 2 years. Yeah, that was enough. So he wound up getting a master's degree, and it's just one heck of a botanist, which is kind of cool. But it's one of my favorite statements. In the end, we will conserve only what we love, we will love only what we understand, and we will understand only what we're taught. So those of you that have been or are teachers, that can be kind of a modest for inspiration. And some of the fun things you can do. This is building the Taj chicken. And some of you may have actually spent some time in there. This is a former student of mine from Iowa. And this is the rolling out of the Taj chicken. And it was rolled out on the pancreas prairie. And the kind of, those of you that have watched chickens, you know the kind of fun you can have watching chickens. I think it'd be called voyeurism or something like that. But anyhow, it can be a lot of fun. And sometimes the people that wind up in a prairie chicken blind can have some influence. And especially if they get for sunrise services, you know, they can get a really positive experience that they're going to talk about and maybe influence other people. And this is from Crookston. We've done a lot of this, as some of you have in other parts of the state as well. So that's pretty cool. Lessons learned, and there'll be more. Be an opportunity for these to be available electronically, right, Bruce? Lessons learned. But one of the things that I want to mention here of this lesson learned, this is from Jason Eckstein, a prairie management guy. But he discovered this really working well in putting in fire breaks. Year 1, you mow the brush. Year 2, you fall mow the sucker shoots. Year 3, you summer burn. And that 3-year approach has worked really well on fire breaks. And Rhett is trying to figure out ways to apply that to the entire prairie. So the power of good observation and practical application is worth a lot. And then again, some of the lessons learned, and you all can access these later. And I'm going to close with this wonderful slide and narrative from Ross Heyer, who all of us, many of us, most of us know and have appreciated his artwork. Our prairies bring me inspiration, for I know of few other habitats that contain so many visible changes on any given day, as well as breathtaking beauty during some seasons and subtle beauty in others. Regardless, the beauty is always there for the human to take in, and after a fire or a grazing episode, the resurrection of nature in our prairies is something to behold. And that's the end. Thank you. And I think I've about exhausted my time.